these enclaves, we are going to really restrict districts' abilities to build when they need to.
I don't know if I'm talking about enclaves, but I am talking about, in my mind, serving the students that generate the eligibility. The pilot program that was in our district, you could use it anywhere you wanted, and what happened is we built capacity, and we weren't able then, we had no eligibility and no way to build the schools for the real growth in the kids when it came. So I have seen both the positive and the negative. There may not be consensus on it, but I felt like the question was worth at least bringing up. And again, I'm not talking about infill projects or small projects. I'm talking when you have major new development, you know, in a community where you're increasing the size of your school district by, you know, 50%. Should there be any requirement that the kids, you know, the kids who are generating that eligibility have actually schools to go to, and the parents don't have to drive them 10 miles across town to go to school?
Just curiosity, what the Assembly member just mentioned, how does that fall into the needs analysis that's conducted through the OPSC?
That is separate. We use, well, districts can use the state standard in terms of a student yield factor. If they think that they have a different higher yield factor, then they can give us a study. But other than that, we don't take a look at the district's needs analysis for purposes of calculating the eligibility. It's strictly current enrollment, prior year's enrollment. If they're requesting dwelling units, we require documentation to verify dwelling units. And if they're requesting a yield factor higher than the state standards, then we need a study to justify the yield factor. But we don't take a look at the needs analysis for purposes of calculating the eligibility currently. So if there are no other questions, I'll quickly go through the options. And again, the options were to meet the objective for this item, which was to reserve eligibility for plan development for those students. So option 1 on page 5, this is basically to restrict the use by high school attendance area. So we use the existing high school attendance area that are pre-established, and if there are developments within that high school attendance area that qualify as dwelling units, then there would be a reservation of eligibility for those students in that particular high school attendance area. On page 6, we have an example. In this example, top of page 6, the dwelling units generated eligibility in 2 high school attendance areas. So the actual dwelling units in high school attendance area number 1 is 600, high school attendance area number 2 is 400. That resulted in an additional augmentation of 80 pupils because of those dwelling units. So we prorate based on 60-40 to come up with 48 additional pupils in high school attendance area number 1 and 32 additional pupils in high school attendance area number 2. So the idea would be that that amount, those number of pupils, would be reserved for each of those high school attendance areas. Now, there would also be potentially additional eligibility from the regular projection, not including the dwelling units, that the district would be have available for unrestricted use. So you would have restricted eligibility for each of the high school attendance areas, and you would have potentially additional eligibility that the district can use anywhere district-wide. And that is reflected in the bottom of page 6. You see the 48 for high school attendance area number 1, 32 for high school attendance area number 2, and 40 for use anywhere district-wide. So that's the basic concept for option 1, is that the additional dwelling units be reserved for the particular high school attendance area that generated the development. We have some considerations for each of the options on the bottom of page 7. First one is obviously that this reduces the district's flexibility. A district could have existing capacity to house the new students near the high school attendance area, not necessarily within the high school attendance area. Those cases may exist. It does add a greater level of complexity for us to process. Currently, we would only process the eligibility district-wide. If we go with this type of system, we would be calculating eligibility based on each of the high school attendance areas as well as district-wide. And there's also a comment that we have that the subcommittee may wish to consider, including some sort of a waiver for school districts if they want to, if they have unique circumstances. So if there are no questions on option 1, I can go on to option 2. So option 2 is the same concept, but basically it's restrict the use by groups of tentative track maps. So it assumes that there's more than one tentative track map and that the additional eligibility generated from these dwelling units would be used either within or in the tentative track map area or within a certain proximity that the subcommittee can consider in terms of how much. So this is the basic difference between this concept and the high school attendance area. This one is where the tentative track maps are actually built. In this particular option, it assumes that there's more than one and that the additional dwelling units have to be, the additional pupil grants would have to be used within those tentative track maps. So some of the considerations are the same as option 1. One thing that we did want to point out to the committee is whether there should be consideration if this is an option only for larger developments and not necessarily smaller ones. And of course, we have to come up with a threshold in terms of how much or how big of a development we should consider for this option. And again, this does create or introduces a greater level of complexity. We have to calculating eligibility, not just district-wide, but also for each of these tentative track map areas. That is option 2. Option 3 is the same concept, but it just restricts the use by individual track map. So instead of option 2, you have multiple ones. This one you have to build within a particular tentative track map. Again, this is the additional eligibility that's generated from these dwelling units would be restricted for this area, and if the district has additional eligibility not from the dwelling units, they can use it anywhere district-wide. And some of the considerations are the same as option 1 and 2. The other thing we have to determine is what kind of a radius. Again, if it's not within within the tentative track map, it's within the vicinity, how much of a radius would be required. So those are the 3 options that we come up with to consider. Be happy to answer any questions.
I do have some questions, but what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is take any public comment, and then we can maybe tie that.
Just put it on the edge, let it
Good afternoon. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Heather Steer, and I'm from Western Placer Unified School District out in Lincoln. I'm the facilities coordinator there, and I'm also on the Legislative Advisory Committee for the Coalition of Adequate School Housing, or CASH. I wanted to talk a little bit about this subject, and even more so, Ms. Buchanan, as you talked a little bit more about the larger developments, because I am one of those, unfortunately, I guess in California now, the odd cases where we will start seeing a large amount of growth. Currently, right now, my district is unified, so it's K-12, and we have about 6,500 students in enrollment. According to the City of Lincoln's General Plan 2050, which was adopted in 2010, officially an update to it, we should be right around 25,000 students by the time we have build out. We're looking at approximately 30,000 new dwelling units.
Which is how many years till build out?
They said it was a 50-year, but I anticipate we're probably going to be looking at 40 years. So, of course, over many years, we will see that. But in addition to that large piece of enrollment growth, we also have a number of infill projects. When things were starting to boom, we had a lot of track maps that were approved, and then they got put on hold. So just alone, aside from those new larger villages, as they call them, I'm looking at seeing about 1,600 more dwelling units from previously approved track maps that had been put on hold. So and of these 7 villages planned for our district, which, as I said, are quite large, there are 3 right now that are in various stages of planning, actually, for annexation to our city. Of those 3 alone, we're projected to see 15,785 new dwelling units.
And that's again over the 40 years?
These ones in particular, I don't think they're going to take that long for build-out. We do have a couple of villages that have not started any sort of planning, so I think those are going to be the ones that are going to hit our tail end.
Okay.
So as I'm saying, we're having this influx that will eventually hit, and also we're having a very large comeback. This is very exciting to us. We love to have new students. So, a good district is a thriving district, as we always say, but we don't have necessarily room for them at our current sites, and we certainly face the same struggles as many other districts how to house new students.
Right.
Right now, we have 1 high school, which we can't afford to modernize. We have 2 middle schools, which we can't afford to modernize, a very old one and one we can't afford to add to. And as we talked about these homes coming in, we're really going to be in a pinch as to how we can start to serve those students unless we are ready to, as you had spoken to, have a school completely on the ground and ready to go, which is very difficult. Obviously, we would still have the need to have the ability to count these as augmentation so we can look towards our future as we get into our eligibility. And, Cash and myself, my district supports the reliance upon this to, figure our eligibility in the future and for the SFP and the use of the tentative and final maps. But we need to be quite certain that we can use all outstanding planned units in our district to calculate this eligibility. So old ones, future ones. That's a very big
Well, they need
feature
to be
us.
active, right? I assume you agree with that.
Yes, absolutely. As I said right now, if we're looking at tentatives, I could technically use these 3 villages that we're discussing right now with the 15,000 homes, and that's quite significant in itself. Not something we'd use today if I had to do it, but something we definitely want to be able to plan for. These sites that we currently have would be more prepared to take in the influx, not just of these large developments as we talked about, but the current infill ones that we're expecting if we had the ability to pass a general obligation bond, which unfortunately my district does not. We have very limited developer fees coming in at this time and will in the future, uncertain of state funding, as we know. So as I've been talking to one of my cohorts is we're kind of like wobbling 2 legs of the 3-legged stool, if you will. Unfortunately, we have a district that is not bond or tax friendly. We have a very high Tea Party participation.
Can you explain why you have limited developer fee ability? I mean, by statute, I would think you would qualify for level 2 developer fees. So can you explain why you have limited developer fee ability?
Well, we do collect level 2. Of course, we have to justify that annually.
Right.
That does go down. And as we go ahead and add these units on, that's if we are able to and somehow mitigate anything with community facility districts and things like that, that's going to negate those houses. So we have the possibility of our level fee 2 going down instead and still not being able to recoup. I mean, we can't put the full burden of building these schools onto our developers. We're only statutory up to level 2. That's not going to build me a comprehensive school.
Well, the whole idea was that would help provide the match for new construction with the state. I don't think developer fees were ever intended to provide 100%. In our district, when we had an 11,000 unit development, we entered into a developer agreement where the developers actually built the schools and we gave them the matching funds we got from the state. I don't think they were intended, but when you said you had limited ability, I was just curious as to why you had.
Maybe I should rephrase that. I can no longer refuse to serve the students. Right. So I can no longer ask for the full amount of money it's going to take to build elementary, middle, and high school classrooms for these students. I can only ask for the level 2 fees. Right. And quite frankly, as I'm looking to serve these students all the way through, they may provide me enough to build an elementary school inside an area, but is it going to be enough to provide for middle and complete high school
I don't want to push,
facilities?
but the level 2 fees, you calculate based on what it costs to build a school, correct, in your developer fee study? And then you come up with what would be a level 3 fee. In other words, it costs X dollars per square foot to build a school. And your level 2 fee is 50% of that. So your level 2 fees should be generating 50% of the cost to build a school in your community.
Actually, from what I understand, we have to, and you can maybe help me out on this a little bit more too, our level 2 fee studies are actually based on certain calculations. So we can only look at certain things in within a 5-year window. So it
Well,
doesn't
yeah, I mean, you
actually
can't
ask.
look at what's going to be, it doesn't make sense that you can look at what's going to, students are going to be there 30 years from now because you assume that they're going to build out because that's their map, but they could abandon that and go somewhere else.
And it
But
also-
for the school, the students who are going to be there, that 5-year, your level 2 fee is based on 50% of the cost to build the school, land and school.
Right, but actually what it does is, what I was going to say is it doesn't actually give us a comparison as to what it costs to put schools on the ground right now. There is no market for that in our level 2. It simply looks at
Well, maybe we can
what's your
talk
cost of
about that
acreage.
offline, because
Yeah.
it should give you what it costs. It should give you 50% of what it costs to build a school right now. I mean,
Isn't it 50% of the allowance that the state would provide to build the school?
no.
So it's capped, some things are capped out on those developer fee studies, the same way that they're capped out on what the state would provide for those school facilities.
So technically under that umbrella, then there
That's
wouldn't
not
be a
true.
need for any sort of general obligation bonds or anything.
Well,
So
all I know is
it would
when
be
we
like
did, when we did
dual.
developer fee studies in our district, they were based on what our cost of the land was, what our cost of construction was, and they were actually based on the cost of building the school, not based on the state allowable cost.
And we've done a study, actually, which I don't have a copy for here, but I'd be happy to forward to you, what we call our shortfall analysis, where we actually did that study. Of course, calculations, as I said, are vastly different from what the state allows us to do under our parameters of our level 2 studies, and actually looked at what average costs for schools were in recent times and in general, as close to areas as we could find, both elementary, middle, and high schools, and then came up with an average per student cost to build those facilities. Then we were able to kind of minus off, okay, this is how much it costs per household, essentially. We got it broken down with student generation
Right.
rate. This is how much it costs per household. How much do I need? You know, this is how much I need per
Are you
house that goes
charging
up.
per household or per square foot?
We have to charge per square foot.
Right.
But I was trying to come up with a study of, you know, what really am I going to see every rooftop? Every rooftop that comes in, how much money would we need? Minus off what we would anticipate seeing in level 2 fees, what we would anticipate in state grants under the current
Right.
program, and then what is our shortfall. So we actually
Right.
do have a study that's like that. That's not our level 2, but it is our shortfall analysis.
Right. The shortfall may be due to the state grants not actually covering 50% versus the level 2 not covering 50%.
And that is a portion of it, too.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a portion of that that shortfall. Yes. So, anyways, we can absolutely, I would love to talk about that, too. I can
Yeah.
get you a copy of that. But anyways, back to what I was saying, is obviously, as we talk about where we want to restrict these use of eligibility or use of grants or use of fees, as we look at these larger villages, it seems very obvious that we can't anticipate for a village, even if it's 3,000 homes, even if it's 4,000 homes, to be able to support probably an elementary school. That wouldn't be a big shake. Maybe not a middle school, and probably definitely not a high school within its own self. It would be a very small high school. So now we're looking at, I've got high school students or middle school students that need to attend in another area, and they may not even be under the same high school. For example, currently in the 3 villages that, and in the handout that I'm giving you, that I attached a map on the back so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about on these villages. We're working with Village 7, which has an elementary school with overflow to an existing elementary school, middle school attendance at an existing middle school, and high school attendance at a high school that we have planned but unfortunately have been unable to build at this time. Village 1, which we're also in talks with, they're about 5,600 homes. They will have 1 regular and 1 small elementary school and some overflow to an existing elementary school or interim. They'll have an existing middle school of attendance at this time with future plans to attend a middle school in a different village that isn't even on the radar right now as far as plans. But as far as when a complete build-out happens, that's going to be the best matriculation for them. And then their current attendance high school is Lincoln High School, which is our 1 high school right now and also a very old existing facility. And then Village 5, which is on the complete other side of town, is the other one that's actually starting their entitlements right now. They'll have 3 elementary schools. They are blessed in having 1 middle school and 1 high school. That high school, though, will be attended by 2 other villages that border at 4 and 5 eventually when they are built out. So as we're talking about restricting those, and even if we look at a high school attendance area, I've got a high school attendance areas, I've got all 4 corners, and the ones that are developing currently aren't contiguous at all. Their borders aren't contiguous as far as their tentative maps. Their high school attendance areas won't be contiguous in some cases. So I'm looking at this pot of money, and if I'm reserved to hold it, where do I put these students temporarily, as you talked about? You do have to house them somewhere. Usually that's in, when we know this flux is coming, we try to do it in something like, portables or modular, something where it's temporary. We know we have an overflow. We can remove those once the student is in their neighborhood school. But I still have to make those campuses workable for those students while they're there. And sometimes if they're some of the first phases on the ground, they could possibly be at that interim site, that particular child, for a while until the house rolls over in its natural stage of life and maybe takes on another family with more, as you said, new students that come into it. So as I'm strategically planning for this, how would I anticipate getting funds to, unless I'm utilizing some of that eligibility or some of those grants, maybe not all of it, because we are looking at portables, which are cheaper, save that money that, we can go to more permanent neighborhood school facilities. I've got multi-purpose rooms that aren't adequate and are old and need modernization. I've got how many accessible restrooms do I have on the campus? That's a big ticket item right now. Not only accessibility, but do you have enough toilets? Do you have enough?
So I've got a question, because I'm not sure we need to go into quite that level of detail. I think we get it, and I'm not sure I'm okay with any of the 3 proposals from staff, even though I appreciate all the work they've done.
It's very nice.
But I think, in my mind, there is sort of that dilemma in terms of, if you're going to grow from where you are now to, what did you say, 25,000 students, okay, clearly, and you're at 6,500 now, and I'm not, let's just say it all were going to happen in the next 5 years, because I'm not sure you should, I know, but let's just say for hypothetical, let's just say it were, or whatever is going to happen. Let's say the next 5 years you're going to go to 10,000 students, because I don't think we should worry about what's going to happen 30 years down the road, because that's a little too speculative. I'm not sure anyone can plan with accuracy at that point in time. We don't even know what the birth rates will be or whatever else, and they probably haven't pulled the tentative maps on what's going to be built that far down the road. So let's say you're going from 6,500 to 10,000, okay? If you're generating new student eligibility for that 3,500 students, clearly you've got to, the people there and the people are indirectly paying the developer fees, the state's giving you the eligibility to follow those students. Clearly, somehow we have to ensure that those students have adequate permanent housing. That's the whole goal of this program, right? Now, I can understand that you may not build a new high school. There's just no way you would generate enough students out of that additional 3,500 to justify a new high school. You may or may not build a middle school. You probably have enough for 2 elementaries. You may have enough eligibility for middle, but you may or may not. So I'm not sure I want to be as rigid as some of the suggestions from staff, even though I think they're taking a look at our goals. But do you think, as a district or board, you should at least be identifying where these students are going to go? You're going to say the students from these villages are going to attend our existing high school, and therefore the high school eligibility for those kids needs to go to making sure we add that, maybe you're going to expand it or whatever is going to for those students, so that they then have classrooms at the high school? It seems to me that while you don't want to be so rigid that I can only spend it here, it also seems to me if they're generating that, the board has some obligation to identify where those students are going to go, whether it's a new school that you have to build, or we're going to expand our middle school or high school or whatever, and there should be some obligation then to have the grants follow. Maybe not completely rigid or whatever, but on the other hand, if you were to use the grants for other purposes, then you have no grants for those students and no classrooms to house them, and I think that's what in my mind we want to try and avoid.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think absolutely, as long as we had some sort of tracking, and I would support that, and I think that's something that we're looking at in our district in particular, is how we want to make sure we've tracked all that money that comes in and make sure that we're not overspending, if you will, even in its own village towards elementary, and then not have enough left over to cover school facilities for middle and high school
Right, and
students
you
as well.
clearly
So,
have to
yeah.
identify. I mean, you're going to have in some area, particularly when you get to the secondary level, but it just seems to me that there's got to be some assurances that the grants you're getting for major new developments, and I don't even know how we, if there's consensus or how we would define infill, other things like that. Clearly, those, it's existing schools.
Just my comments on this is, one, I don't know if there's concern. And I think the more you try to put in codes and regulations, the harder it is to be flexible, and you're going to have this 4, 5, 6 year type build out. I think one of the things that this process took this board for a little bit has identified was that, from start to beginning, by the time we get bond funds out and chase it out, it does take multiple years to get down, and it's hard. Now, I've sat in these planning meetings on city council and my county board to say, something like this kind of plan, we want to plan out 50 years to make sure that we put in our artillery roads in, we're putting our infrastructure, we build out. But more than likely, it's not going to happen. I still have plans in our books from 30 years ago for our area. They were, for the west end of San Bernardino, that was going to grow another 5,000 to 10,000 homes. It's not going to happen until the economy comes back. It may happen 50 years from now, for 100 years from now. So you can't really go off this. I agree with that. But I think the best way we could do is empower our staff to look at and make common sense decisions. Okay, this is what they're applying for. They're using this data. They're using more on the conservative side a little bit of things. Make sure you check them, the balance. Say they come up with a 5,000 track map, and you call the city and say, well, they only asked for the first 200 house phase, and the economy is kind of slow, but we're expecting this. Then you make the best judgment. You're more on the conservative side, and that way, if a school district has a problem for your staff's recommendation or ruling, then that's when you come to us, and you present to us and say, here's our data behind it. We don't want to just go for the 200 or 500 homes that we project in the next 3 years, but we want to go for the 3,000 homes we expect because this is what's going on. These are the trends. And it's more of a consensus of that way. But the more we put in the rules and regulations, it's going to be harder for the districts and the staff to really match up. And I too appreciate all the work trying to put it in. And you can see the goals we're trying to do. And it may not be that many bad examples out there, but we don't want to come back after we're spending the taxpayers' bond money to bond out for 30 years and have it come back 10 years, or new administration from your school come back, well, we didn't use these, we built this, this, and this, now I have no place to put my kids, but you have no more eligibility. Mm-hmm. And that's the one thing we want to try to avoid is, are we building capacity on this 30-year bond money and not temporary buildings, not portables, not the other things that we nice to have for here and now, but we want to make sure that the long-term planning is behind there. And have confidence in our staff to kind of make those judgments, and if there's a process that if the district does not agree with the staff's recommendation, can come back up for the board to hear and vent. I think that's kind of the direction I would go.
When you have a new village and you're working with developers and the city or county, whichever agency is approving it, do you not identify where those students are going to go to school or where the schools are going to be in the beginning of that process?
We currently, in our jurisdiction, we are asked to work with the developers to identify possible future school sites. Their EIRs to date have not identified interim sites for the students to go to. It has not spoken to that, nor has it really been addressed how we're going to pay for those school sites if we don't have appropriate funds. So our city is a little bit... trying to be very politically correct here, a little bit behind some of the other times in districts around us because this is fairly new growth. It's very rural for a very long time. We got a patch of growth, everybody got to get real excited, and then a downturn. So they haven't seemed to want to engage a school district on a base level so that we can really address a lot of those mitigation concerns.
So what do you do when you comment on the EIR? I mean, obviously you have to say we can't accommodate these students in the current schools that we have. Therefore, I mean, you've got to make that finding basically to assess your level 2 fees, right?
Absolutely.
You can't, and so therefore, we are going to need to build new schools or classrooms to be able to accommodate them.
We do. We address in writing when EIRs are put around for comment. We have done public comment at numerous meetings. In fact, right now we are in litigation with our local jurisdiction, so over CEQA issues.
Yeah. So I don't know if you need to come up. So my belief is I don't want to be completely rigid. On the other hand, whether the board, there's some kind of finding by the board or clearly some plan that shows, okay, you know, we're using this eligibility from, in your case, these new villages or whatever. You know, we know that it's supporting the schools that those students are going to, permanent schools those kids are going to attend, whether it's a new school you're building or a high school you're expanding. It just seems to me there ought to be some kind of nexus there.
I guess I'm on the opposite side of it. We have differences of opinion. I just believe that that districts should have the flexibility to use their eligibility as they roll out their projects appropriately. I think that they at the local level have the best sense where the next new school needs to be built, when that high school can be built, when they can generate enough funding for those larger facilities like high schools. And I think that if we put the dollar, you know, on the dwelling unit or on the student, that we are going to slow down the potential construction, because those monies could just pool waiting for the school that could be built when they could be utilized better, I think, in a district. And I'm just not convinced there's a problem.
Would you ever allow a district, if there was a scenario where they did use their eligibility, now they have the growth, but then no more eligibility left, come back for emergency funds and grants?
No, I don't. I think that they've used their eligibility, and they have to live with the accountability and the consequences of that. Again, have we had an appeal that said, I used my eligibility over here and now I need it over here? I don't recollect one. So that's where I'm saying I'm not sure about the problem.
I don't think that's an appeal you'd ever have, do you? I mean, you
Then
might end up with a financial hardship, but I don't know how you'd have an appeal to say, I made a mistake, I used my eligibility when I shouldn't have, so can you give it back to me?
Well, I just think that we have had a very, particularly around enrollment projections, you know, we've had a system that's been in place for a long time trying to project out enrollment so that we were building schools on time. You know, in my trench years, we were never, that cohort never caught up to what we actually needed, but it was the system in place and you utilized it and you built the schools the best that you could. I just think it's a micromanagement that is, I'm not convinced yet we need to solve.
I respect that, and for what it's worth, I'm not talking about the cohort. I'm talking about when you're building.
Well, it's an augmentation to the cohort,
right? Right.
And it's
but the growth
it's
that comes
looked
out
at
of the cohort,
overall. It's not looked at unless you're a high school attendance area. It's looked at overall, and then we give districts that overall capability to address the needs where they determine they need to.
But the growth that comes from the cohort could well be just of houses turning over within a district, and that should stay within the core. I'm talking about when you add on to that cohort for tentative maps for major developments that have been approved, should those have to follow, whether they're following in existing schools. I know you're waving your head no. I'm just bringing up the question. We may not go there, but if those kids are going to attend existing schools or if they're going to attend new schools, should there be some, some identification of where those students are going to be housed, knowing that you're actually spending money to house those students. That's, so I'm clearly we're going to agree to disagree on this, but are there any more questions or any more comments?
Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Allen, Sacramento City Unified School District. I just want to offer a couple of comments that may or may not have been maybe vetted thoroughly when this topic came up. My old district, so it was kind of interesting to hear about what's going on there. Some things never change. Not your fault, by the way, Heather. So, big district where I'm at right now, we are, I guess you would call us a declining enrollment district. I like to think we're leveling off a little bit. And we would be the infill projects that we briefly mentioned today. And so if this type of a concept is to go forth, I guess I like the idea of at least being able to discuss what would happen if this was applied to school districts such as mine that has some infill projects. So the three things that really stick out in my mind are we have open enrollment, we have program improvement, and we have schools of choice. So I have really no say where those kids are going to go from that infill development. They could go across town. So if I have to stick to an attendance boundary area, it's just going to be a challenge. So I just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to discuss any of the ramifications that might happen because of that.
I think I've said clearly, I think with infill, I think that's a whole different story than when you're actually taking land, having a whole new development, and bringing that in.
Okay.
So,
and then just my last comment, and it was kind of mentioned up here. You know, with all the emphasis that we've seen directed to us with Prop 13 and the Governor's Initiative and LCFF, it is all about local control. And again, taking away that flexibility to be able to, I don't use the word control, but to control it at a local level would really be very taxing to us. So we're trying to abide by that. We're trying to make adjustments and move forward. And I think having this flexibility allows us to continue to do that. So thanks for your time.
you're welcome. Any more comments on this? I think we're now.
You have another.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alana Cunningham from Jack Schrader's office, and I just wanted to make a big picture comment, and that is that I think that the new construction calculations are adequate, and I think it gives districts reasonable options for determining new construction eligibility. And I think that for the most part, districts make, you know, I think we need to have the confidence in the district administration to build schools where they're needed, where development is occurring. With that being said, I think that there are some scenarios which these proposed changes wouldn't fix, and that is, for example, if the planning department says, okay, there's a building A in this high school attendance area, development A in this high school attendance area, and development B in this high school attendance area, and development A is going to occur first, so the district uses eligibility to put the project there, and then after everything's already going, they realize that, okay, there's been a change, the development is actually going to happen at development B. So they're building the school over here, the development has changed to here, and in the end, it will work out. It will be an inconvenience for a while, but I just wanted to point out that these changes wouldn't address that, because if both developments have tentative approvals, both could be included. So I think it's a timing issue.
That's only if you restrict to high school attendance area, which I'm not sure that as I said, I personally am not sure I agree with.
Right.
I just, my question is should there be any tie on where you have whole new developments, any tie to making sure you've got housing for those students?
And I guess my point is that both of those developments would be approved and both could be used.
Right.
But the timing isn't ideal, and there was a change that would be out of the district's control, unforeseen.
Right. I think I'm in agreement with you.
So, just wanted to.
It seems like under that scenario, option 2 would work, because you can group the two tentative track maps and build within those two developments. Just an idea.
But you would still have a scenario where you have a school over here when it would have been better to put it over here. But because you're already started.
You have to allow that look. My issue is, suppose I want to build a theater at high school A. And I say, okay, I've got this eligibility. Even though the eligibility is coming from these villages that are generating those students, I'm going to go ahead and use, 300 students for the theater. Now, all of a sudden, a few years down the road, I have overcrowding at my schools, and I've got these 300 kids that I used, and I really need to expand an elementary school, but I've used my grants, I can't use it on those kids, so now I've got to send the kids across town 10 miles to a school.
But at the same time, sometimes districts know that they have a need now that they want to address, and they have a plan, knowing that they're going to have students in the future and they have a different plan and they meet both needs by planning. And I think
Right,
just,
but I mean, the question in my mind, again, is just, and I may be in the minority, but I'd want to at least discuss it, is, should there be any way, in a broad sense, without being prescriptive, and I don't want to tell districts how to plan, that we know that, the grants ultimately are going to house students. Whether you add in attendance area A or B first, I don't really care. But it's pretty hard to explain to parents, well, the reason I have to divert your kids to a different school is because I spent my eligibility on those students to build this nice theater at this school, and we can't afford it, I mean, that's was my only question I have. And there may not be support for it or not, but I'm just questioning whether or not there's any kind of balance there.
okay, thank you.
I don't think, are there more comments? I don't think we have any consensus, so whether we we'll bring it up again later, bring it forward, bring both ideas up or drop it, I don't know. We can kind of figure out where we're going to go later on that. The next item is consolidating grants, supplemental grants. And maybe, since I don't want to speak for the members, but since we've gone over several times the types of grants and everything there are, maybe we can sort of get down to the recommendations, which really show that most of them are very specific and we probably can't consolidate. But anyway, I know you've taken a look at it.
Okay.
Thank you. My name's Tracy Sharp, and I'm presenting the item on the options for consolidating grants. Thank you for that introduction, Madam Chair.
That's right.
And we did look at, and you can see the initial part of the item here is basically an overview and analysis. How often are these grants drawn on? What are the criteria? How are they calculated? Their average grant amounts. That and, as I said, the criteria for them, we looked at them closely to see what makes sense to potentially combine. And so there is a fair amount of background there, or statistics on the grants themselves that were offered over since 1998. And so if we do jump in directly, as you mentioned, to the options, what we looked at for new construction, potential best candidates, are the automatic fire detection and alarm system grant and the automatic sprinkler system grant as potential ones to roll into the base grant. Now, the automatic fire detection and alarm grant, for the most part, applies to all projects. When it was implemented, basically it's for all new classrooms get this grant and are required to put in a fire detection and alarm system. They were approved or submitted and approved by DSA after July 2002. So for the most part, under new construction, that's going to be every project. Except there's one exception, and that's the temporary portable. So there is that one exception in the statute. It's grade level specific, so it would match when the CCI is adjusted each year. This is adjusted as well, so it fits in there. That was one of our considerations. Now, the automatic sprinkler system grant, while it follows a similar pattern, it is slightly different, and there's more than one exception here. The exception, of course, is the standalone portable building. And then also, it applies to all new schools submitted to DSA after July of 2002. But there's a differentiation here between additions to existing sites and new schools. So if your site existed and the plans were approved before the July 2002 date, you're not required to put in the sprinkler, and therefore the project wouldn't qualify for the grant. So there's a possibility here that those additions to existing sites, that group of projects, if it were rolled in, would be potentially given an extra amount, resulting in overfunding. So there's that exception on this particular grant. And so those were the two with those caveats I mentioned about the exclusions and how additions are looked at slightly differently would be reasons or considerations, basically, for rolling it in or not rolling it in. So those are the two for new construction. And I will jump to Part B of Option 1, which addresses the supplemental grants for the modernization program, which is on page 35. And once again, we've looked at the automatic fire detection and alarm. Similar reasons this one fits in that it's required for all projects with the exception of that temporary portable building that's going to be sited for less than 3 years. And so if we looked at our numbers and why they didn't get it, basically if they didn't take the grant, it was mostly because it was predated its establishment. And it basically, the $200,000 project value is the trigger for this, and most mod projects that we see come in are at least that. So it gets triggered. The other grant that we looked at that is related to fire code requirements and also includes accessibility upgrades is the supplemental grant that provides a district, there's two options actually for this supplemental grant. One is a basic 3% increase to cover the cost of accessibility and fire code upgrades that are required by building code. And the other is one that we often refer to as the 60% option. It's what is the district spending, what's the minimum work required to bring it up to current building code in regards to the accessibility requirements and fire life safety requirements. We'll look at that, the total cost estimate for those upgrades, take a deduction for an amount that's included in the mod-based grant, and come up with what, like I say, we often refer to as the 60% option for the supplemental grant. And we have some stats there on how often it's been requested since it came into play in 2007 that the option was available to districts, and we see about a 75-25 split in the occurrence. Now, the 3% option, like I say, is a flat amount. The 60% option is intended to provide grants that are more closely related to what's actually happening on the project itself. So the consideration here is that if it were rolled in as a flat amount, that it would not be project specific anymore. It would be a flat amount. Some projects might get less, some would get more. It would be less project specific.
The problem with ADA is that depending on the type of school and the elevations and everything, it can vary so dramatically from one school to the next. It seems to me if you're going to consolidate, you might as well just either do the 60% for all or keep the two programs. But I don't know how you come up with a flat number for all schools that ends up being equitable.
And that is a consideration for many of these grants. Is these supplemental grants are focused on what are your conditions at your site. That's part of the qualifying criteria for the supplemental grants. It's an attempt to recognize what's happening at an individual site that would incur additional costs. It might happen on school A over here, but not be happening on school C over there.
Can I just follow up on that? I'm just a little bit confused. So if I'm putting in the fire detection or wherever the system may be, I have to get the whole school ADA compliant in order to stick that in?
Possibly.
So how many schools are we not hitting because they can't afford their portion to do ADA compliance because of that, and how many doesn't have protection or upgrades because of that?
Well, yeah, that's a tough question to answer. We don't know. But again, if you look at the structure of the additional, this is additional grants that we're talking about. This is above and beyond the base grant for modernization. So the 3% is a percentage of the base grant. The 60% is the actual cost estimate that it takes to get them compliant.
And we did 800, altogether we did 1,000 projects, 1,100 projects.
Yes.
So there's a lot more need for what we've done, but.
And that 1,000 projects represents, since there have been two options prior to that, the districts had the 3% option. It's only been since 2007 that both options were available to districts.
Bill, do you have any comments?
I just thought it would be interesting for the members to think about, because part of what we're sort of dancing around here is how do we be as specific about each project as possible and yet keep it simple? Why don't we go back to a cost per square foot? In other words, previous programs have paid $1 per square foot cost based upon the actual construction incorporated in the DSA plans. It might be another way to think about it, just as an option.
But what do you do for a school that was built in the 60s or 70s, you know, the ones that sort of had the what I would call the finger design, you know, an administration building and all the classroom wings, and it's all on one level, and accessibility isn't a major issue. Then you go into a city where you've got 2 or 3 stories, and maybe you don't even have an elevator, maybe you do, maybe you've got all different other issues. And so the cost for ADA per school can vary dramatically. And one school sort of comes out ahead and another school doesn't have enough. And ADA compliance can eat up a significant portion of the modernization funds that you're using, you know, particularly on the district side. So it just seems to me that on the one hand that simplifies, but on the other hand, I'm not sure it simplifies in a way that we can say overall it's still an equitable program.
Well, and remember, the local district's going to be paying a share of that. So if the local district in San Francisco with the hilly site for ADA is going to be paying a lot more money than the flat site area.
But if we just give them all a flat amount.
Well, no, we're talking, I mean, the concept would be if you used $1 per square foot, that it would be based upon the cost of construction, the actual cost to build the project.
But if we're giving them a cost per square foot.
You develop a cost per square foot for the project, and then you split it, whatever the state share, local share match is, and use that.
So you're going to use the cost per square foot that ties to a specific project, or this an average?
I'm just throwing the concept out.
Well, I'm just trying to have a better understanding of what your concept is. Is it to tie it to what the actual construction cost is? I mean, a lot of your construction costs go up in the city if you have to do your staging 2 blocks away or whatever. So is it going to be unique to
So that would be reflective of the urban site security impact supplemental grant that gets added on in that location. So that gets reflected in that actual cost. There may be some old timers in the room. Didn't we have a program that used a cost per square foot previously?
I mean, old timer. I don't know if I like that. But certainly built schools under square footage. And I was going to actually bring it up during the classroom count discussion. I think it's an open topic that could be part of the deliberations here, because we did convert from a square footage program to an ADA program, and each have their benefits and liabilities. Square footage, you definitely are paying for what type of square footage you're building, and then you have to equalize it out for some things that you're talking about. So, you know, if you're in an urban area, and as I recollect, we had the geographic enhancers, or whatever we call them, indices for different areas, because it, you know, or if you're constructing in Tulare and it's really hard to get people to come out there to build a building, it's reflected in the construction costs, and we reflected those in the indices. So I actually think the square footage and the per ADA basic program element issue would be a good one, a good topic of discussion. And this is one component of that.
Yeah. And again, this topic and the others assumes that the same system continues. Talking about a whole new system at a cost per square feet is a fundamentally change in the way we fund the program, so it would require much more extensive analysis.
If you're going to talk about that, you should have area adjustments in your basic grants. I mean, it's not just ADA, it's the whole cost of building.
So it sounds like we want to make it more complicated than what it is. So we're not simplifying. I mean, that's
well, I think, I mean, maybe there's consensus on the fire alarm and the other, the sprinklers, the automatic fire detection alarm system and the sprinkler system, into just increasing the grant amount for that. But before, can we, I So I know, Tom, you look like you're ready to say something. Is there anyone in this public that would like to comment on this issue before we? Yeah. We need you to come up here and speak in the mic so we can record.
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Cardone with San Francisco Unified. We've just completed a 2006 bond program at approximately 35 sites that were state funded with mod funds. And we found the supplemental grant for access, life, safety to be very beneficial, as it really assisted us in bringing those buildings into full compliance and not eating into the actual building improvements we were making at those facilities. So I urge you not to change that.
So let me ask this. I mean, I think ADA compliance, at least I'm with you on, it's too unique to try and fold it in. If we increase the base grant for fire, life, and safety, would that be a problem? Or, I mean, so if you don't eliminate it, but you fold it into the base grant and increase the base grant?
Well, it would depend on what the difference is. The 3% access, life, safety really is pretty minimal when you look at the total base grant. The additional 3% isn't that great.
No, that's ADA. I'm talking about the fire and sprinklers and the alarm and the.
I thought that the 60% included an actual cost estimate for both ADA and fire life safety.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is if, okay, you're right on the 60%. So if we took out accessibility and dealt with the fire detection alarm and the automatic sprinkler, that?
No, because DSA requires us to meet a minimum requirement. And the difference between the 3% bump up to the base grant and the 60% is significant. And I don't know in your proposal about square footages or making some base grant allowance. The program as it is has been a huge benefit to San Francisco Unified.
Right.
So, depending on your future conversations and direction, I don't have an answer. I'm just here to say that the program as it is for that 60% has really aided us.
And if we left the 60% the way it is, in terms of like on new construction, the automatic fire detection alarm system, automatic sprinkler, do you have an opinion on whether that could be simplified by adding it into the base grant, or whether that should remain separate?
Well, again, the difference is significant, and I just prefer to keep it the way it is.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments from anyone? All right, okay.
Good morning. My name is Tim White, Associate Superintendent from Oakland Unified. Interesting conversations today for us. I think that what I'd like to make in terms of a statement to the board is related to a particular project that you guys have actually done a great job in supporting us with. We're currently in the process of building a elementary school. Actually, it's going to be a K-12 called La Escalita Elementary School. Some of you guys have actually visited that site. And we were actually very blessed to receive about $25 million in funding associated with the project. The project is about a $100 million project. Wow. And we actually took advantage of several of the supplemental grants in addition to the base grant to build this project. Obviously, the bulk of the money comes from local bond funds. And so one of the experiences for us is that we were able to build a very comprehensive school program that actually incorporated in elements from high performance incentive grants, that incorporated in elements associated with academic curriculum to make sure that the facility itself is actually matched and conducive to deliver the type of curriculum that we want to have in that particular school site. And I think what I would like to urge this board to do is to actually look at the combining of these supplemental types of grants. Ultimately, for us, a school district that has about 500 acres of land and in a city like Oakland. We're the second largest landowner in the entire city next to the port. And so as school districts in an urban context, like ourselves, gets an opportunity to build new facilities, our experience has been one that's been successful, but we would like to see the program streamlined. We'd like to see a more streamlined application process that's a little bit more simple to encourage school districts like Oakland to be more comprehensive in its approach to integrating in things like healthcare clinics, things like nutrition programs that actually offer urban kids access to food and fresh food and healthcare clinics, all of those things that urban kids necessarily need to buttress their learning. And as you guys are able to create a program for us that allows us to be inclusive, we think that a program that lines up with facilities and the way that facilities are funded should be lined up in the same manner that you've lined up the local control funding formula. And so we don't think that there's a difference between how these two should be looked at. We think that the separation between what's happening with academia and the local control funding formula and how we're piecemealing a lot of the things associated with the building program are not very conducive for the type of learning environment that we ultimately need. And that if you were able to find a way to package these supplemental grants in a fashion that made it simpler for us, it allows us to be more comprehensive and actually put into place structures and educational environments that actually start to address the needs of those people, particularly in urban areas that have been the least well served as we go forward. I think it's not lost on this committee that modernization does create in an urban environment. As an example, in my environment where I have 680 portables and 30% of those are older than 60 years old. I actually have 340 core buildings, and approximately 64% of those are older than 50 years old. And so in an environment where you have a competitive marketplace for students, buildings are actually no different than some of the devices that you actually have there on your desk. Buildings are actually third teachers for students as well. And as we start talking about equity, implementation of the Common Core, smarter balance assessment, we really have to give some thought to how we address old stock, urban stock, to make sure that urban kids have an equal opportunity as well as those kids receiving the benefits of new construction dollars that give them different environments that also immediately put them in a position to be more successful down the road.
I actually agree with you, and where Oakland is really lucky is you do pass bonds because there are rural areas that can't pass bonds. But I'd be just curious and also grateful if some of the concepts you're saying, if you have specific concrete ideas on how to, combine the grants or consolidate or, do something different. I mean, I'm sort of hearing that everyone likes the way the program works now, and even staff is having trouble identifying ways that we can consolidate. But if you have ideas, if you could actually put them down on paper and actually give us examples of how you think that would work, that would be very helpful.
Just, you mentioned a lot of your buildings over 50 years old and some of your portables over 30 or so year old. And you have the ability to bond. And so have you not kept up, the city's not kept up the maintenance or the replacing of like portables? Because the intent of portables way back when would be portable, not permanent structures. So how did you get so far behind?
So it's actually an interesting question. I would actually think we're actually the flip side of the coin of the question. We're actually ahead. In the last 10 years, we've replaced over 220 portables, still leaving us with 680 portables on that campus and on our campuses. And so we've replaced a huge amount of those portables, and our direction from the board, given the bonding capacity, was to prioritize the replacement of portables with core facilities. Obviously, Oakland is in an area that's urban impacted, and so we have small campuses and not a lot of land availability. And as we've replaced those 200 portables, we've replaced them with new core facilities. The reality for us is that we were so far behind the 8 ball to begin with. that even replacing 220 portables has left us with this reality of additional portables and their need for replacement.
And I guess that's my biggest concern going forward, is we went through this huge growth spurt of state, local bonding over the last 15 years, close to, $35 state $1 billion and God knows $70 billion locally. That's unsustainable. You cannot keep this going for the next, and that's been over 15 years. You cannot keep doing this. And for new areas where you have new construction bonds and fees coming in, you may be able to build a new school now and then and maybe it'll help out. But if you don't have a maintenance program where you could basically put money away when you build this new building so you can replace it 40 years from now, and there's somehow built into some kind of structure, the state cannot, at least in my opinion, keep bonding out the way it has been, and I don't think locals can do that either. And that's a bigger question. That's what we're trying to get to, the ultimate answer. But if we're working on bonds and development fees to maintain schools, and that's the only money you're looking at doing that, it's not sustainable. And all this money we put in, the $100 billion we spent in the last 10 years, 30 years from now, all these buildings will be out unless you keep up the maintenance and keep them going and, build structures that you can keep up, modernize all the time. I don't know. I'm just, you're a big district and it hasn't been a lot of development, and so how do you, as an urban city, keep this going all the time?
I think for us it's been challenging, as you've noted. Oakland, in spite of being one of the most impacted urban areas in the country, we've passed over $1 billion in bonds. We have continued to go to the voters, most recently in November for $475 million, and they approved it almost with a referendum vote of close to 80%. And so still an insufficient amount to actually support the need. And so if we do have an opportunity to present to this committee some ideas, some specific ideas about reform, particularly as it relates to those school sites in urban environments that have the similar type of conditions that we do, we would welcome that opportunity.
I would just echo the chair's comments on if you have ideas that we could consider, particularly on two fronts. One on serving students in urban areas around modernization, and how what are issues that we should consider in that context. And secondly, having had the benefit and pleasure of seeing La Escalita, which is an exemplary school, and how it serves students in the 21st century. If we also, in a new construction aspect, if you have ideas around how we can provide incentives for more types of those, more of those schools being built in our urban areas, I too would appreciate that. So thank you.
What's the enrollment at La Escalita? What's the projected enrollment there?
So interesting, La Escalita at the current time, elementary school is about 360 students.
But you said it's going to be a K-12.
Yeah, the elementary school, La Escalita, is about 360. It has a magnet high school at the time, enrollment about 200 students. And we are building a middle school component as well.
So what's the capacity going to be for the school?
Total capacity for the school will be about 800.
So you're going to spend $100 million to provide 800 student capacity?
Yeah, it's much more than a school. I mean, obviously it's a community center. It's going to have a community kitchen. It's grid neutral. We won't actually be paying any bills whatsoever on that in terms of our energy costs. And it has a huge amount of features, television studios, and so it's an integrated community site in addition to elementary school.
Okay. Yeah, if you could share your thoughts with us, that would be wonderful, and you can send it to me or to Lisa or Bill, and we'll make sure that all the members get a copy. So, we had, or at least I had, a grand idea that maybe we could consolidate grants and simplify, and I think we're probably finding out that it's easier said than done, although we can certainly, if the governor asks about simplifying, we can certainly say we looked at it. I don't know if anyone else has any comments there.
And I'm not picking on your plan because I'm sorry. The gentleman just left from Oakland. I'm not trying to pick on your local decision to make that school or that facility for $100 million, but that's roughly $120,000 per student in construction costs for the amount of services being served there. And I'm just wondering, how can the community keep affording the bond that aggressively? Are they paying them down quickly, or are you, how do you afford something like that? I could buy them all new condos.
All new condos?
Yeah.
So, it is a priority for Oakland to actually look at the demographics in our communities and make sure that we actually build in those communities that have been disenfranchised the same type of facilities that affluent neighborhoods actually get. And so if you actually come to Oakland, you will see local dollars being put into some of the most energy efficient, cutting edge, technologically advanced facilities possible, and they're in the middle of some of the worst depressed areas of Oakland. We believe that it's necessary to help close the achievement gap and the opportunity gap. For us, this project started out as an $80 million project. We hope to bring it in at $80 million. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know. We're in a phase 2 right now. We typically have spent about $60 million, $70 million a year in facilities improvements. And the only thing that you can look forward to, I think, in terms of hope and possibilities for a town like Oakland is through education. We have one of the highest crime rates in the entire nation.
I was wondering, I mean, you have a lot of other issues there and locally, and I'm sure there's a lot of priorities from the local government to try to figure out what is their priorities.
Right.
Is it infrastructure? Is it education? Is it crime? All the rest. That's an aggressive. I'm just, I'm off topic a little bit. I'm just curious to hear those numbers coming from a local, former mayor and all the rest of it, trying to divide it out. I come from a pretty well-to-do area, and we don't have any of those type of facilities in there, even brand new. Our city's only 20-plus years old, so our facilities are 20 years old or less. And this stuff I commissioned 6 years ago didn't have, any of the things you brought up. So we had a hard time paying for it.
So, again, $475 million passed in bond last year. Prior to that, about $1.2 billion in bonding since 1994, and three different bond measures. And for us, we've actually leveraged that into maybe $1 against every, or maybe 30 cents state money for every dollar that the school district, the local community actually puts in. And so we continue to go out to the voters, and the voters there, knowing that the state has not actually carried their share, has continued to put out money in their own pockets. And so very rarely have they not approved the general obligation bond for us, in spite of them carrying the bulk of the financial burden for the program. There is still a huge need.
Great, thank you. Sorry to bring this up.
I think one of the other things too, for a lot of the urban projects, especially like Mr. White's in Alameda County, the projects I worked on in Contra Costa, the project involves demolishing an entire city block or so, basically, and then temporary housing, relocation, all the expenses of that, then redeveloping. So it's not really like building a new school in a greenfield area.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of significant costs related to that, and your per student cost goes way up.
Thanks.
Okay, are we ready to move on? Any more comments?
Good.
Portable, we're now moving on to portable classrooms, tab 3.
Okay, I'll be speaking to that item as well. And it seems timely that we're coming up on this discussion right now with
I know.
everything that has been discussed up to this point.
Right, so maybe we can, do we have an objection with moving to the options on this as well?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
So our goal here with the options, and I'm starting on page 54 of the item, is we looked at this from the perspective of the whole idea of funding portables or not funding portables, and looked at it like, if we do this in new construction, what does the flip side on modernization do? And basically, it goes from funding of most restrictive to maybe least restrictive, and each of the options could meet different goals or combination of goals. So the first one basically is, as I said, most restrictive. It would suggest no funding for under new construction or mod for portables. And this would require changes to education code. We have some considerations listed here in that it would take away flexibility from districts in how they add capacity to their sites. And without participation on the mod side, they couldn't even replace existing portables. And then we've also noted the consideration that under the government code, one of the potential criteria for being able to levy developer 2 fees is to have 20% of your capacity as relocatable. So those would be considerations if it were a no funding for either program. Option 2 would suggest potentially no new construction funds for adding new portables, or not allowing the use of new construction funds for portables. And for modernization, limit it to allow the use of modernization funds and to generate eligibility for portables, and potentially allow a district, if they were intending to replace a portable, to do it possibly before the 20-year mark as an incentive to do that a little bit earlier. And once again, there are educational code changes that would be required, and the considerations are the same as with the first option. Then moving along to option 3, it's again a similar to the prior two, but in this case, once again, provide no new construction funding for portables, and limit the use of modernization eligibility to just replacement of portables with permanent. And in considering these options, we looked into what is the cost of a portable and came up with some very rough estimates. We put out some calls to the manufacturers and said, okay, what's the base cost of a portable, a basic 960 square foot classroom, and got back the $55,000 is the base cost for that portable. Now that doesn't include getting that portable fully functioning on the site, so we in addition contacted some districts and found out that it really depends on the site conditions. It could range anywhere from an additional $58,000 up to potentially an additional $200,000, depending on the extent of utilities and how this needs to be hooked up to get it fully functional and usable as a classroom. So as I said, this is very rough estimate, just to get an idea for a discussion on this item. So what we found out in that a basic average, that the cost would be roughly $146,000 based on those calls that we made.
Right.
Averages, yes. And so in looking at this, basically comparing that to could it fit in the modernization program as a replacement. So we put that in there for comparison. In order to do this, there are potentially 2 ways that it could be done. That under the program changes necessary under page 60, one option is to create say a supplemental grant to augment the current modernization grant. We could do that potentially in regulation. That would help a district fill that gap between replacement from their base modernization grant. Or the second option to accomplish this could be to make a change specifically to the education code and basically increase the mod grant if this option were pursued. So the considerations, once again, are similar, and with the additional consideration here that it could increase the need for modernization bond authority if more per pupil grant is provided to do these replacements only. But all the other considerations remain the same.
There any questions? Is there any comment from the public on this?
Did my pages get mixed up?
Every district has portables, right?
Madam Chair, committee members, Joe Dixon, I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Facilities, Santa Ana Unified School District. I might wrap in a few of your topics today with the handout that I gave you. What I gave you is one of our elementary school sites we transformed from a K-5 to a K-8 configuration. That was to allow parental choice. With urban districts or every district, boundaries really are non-existent. Kids can attend schools outside their boundaries. We had many parents who asked that we change the configuration of this site to allow, really to stay in the district because there weren't any other options. How we paid for that's 8 portable classrooms. They're installed at grade with foundations.
Right.
They're stucco wrapped. They're nice buildings. They're very nice buildings, and they came in.
Are these the wheel-on that you put in stem walls and installed at grade, or are they the ones where you pour the slab and
we did all the site work. They were manufactured off-site, brought in, and constructed on-site. 2 pieces per portable classroom. Was that the question?
Sorry, could you, the question was, are they the wheel-on, or are they the ones where you actually pour the slab and basically construct them?
No, they're built off-site and wheeled on and then finished at the site.
So then if you want to remove them, you can put the wheels back and you take them to another site. So they're truly...
Wheels?
Well, we've had discussions about what is a portable versus a modular or whatever. So.
Yeah, no. They're brought out on a trailer with a oversized on the freeway.
Right, and so you have the choice of you could just bring it, leave them on the. You can leave them with put the ramps, or you can do what you did in terms of
flush. Yeah.
Yeah, we've put them in at grade. I just want to be sure I have an apples to apples understanding of.
Well, and I want to talk about for a minute Mr. Hagman's question earlier about how do you get so many portables and things like that too. Remember, before 1998, we had that 30% portable component or relocatable to use the correct word.
Yeah.
Then class size reduction came in, and remember when that came in, we had months to put that into place. Right. And then for school districts like Santa Ana, we had the Quality Education Investment Act, QEA, that came in for class size reduction, so we added portables then. In Santa Ana, though, let me make this point. We've removed, since 2009, we've removed 385 portables. But the option to have portables is important for districts because you can do it quick, you can do it relatively cheap, and they're really good buildings. And how long do they last? It depends on any building how you maintain them. You fix the roof, you fix the air conditioning, you take care of them. They last a long time. They're made of steel and wood and concrete and all those things that permanent buildings are made from. So, I think the option of portables is an important one for school districts. And again, we use developer fees. We don't have any new construction eligibility. We don't have any local bond money, and that's how we did that project. That was the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. Darrell Taylor, I'm from Colton Joint Unified School District. I have some familiarity with that project. I formerly worked in Santa Ana, and so I'm really familiar with that site in particular. I wanted to say, given the context that Joe just spoke in, I thought that there were a lot of good ideas in terms of how to address a district's desire, in this particular section, how to address a district's desire to remove portable classrooms and replace it with something permanent. I think that's something a lot of districts want to do. In Colton, our 2 comprehensive high schools, we just completed a 3rd comprehensive high school, but the existing comprehensive high schools had buildings from the 30s from the 50s, from the 70s. And each campus had almost 100 portables on them. And we've removed over half of those portables from each of those sites. And so that's a focus of our district as well. But I do believe that there's an ongoing need, depending on conditions, right? And if you look across all the districts in the state, increases in enrollment, some of the conditions that Joe spoke of, increases in enrollment, you might have a need for portables. And I think that those things should be funded. But one of the things that I think the discussion may have started on here is that within the context of this section, at least I'd say 6 of the 7 options, if they're combined in some fashion, might really bring some shape to some of the things that districts are trying to do. So on the one hand, I certainly think that we still need to fund portables in terms of whether it be new construction, you might have a need, as it was talked about earlier, in a fast-growing district, and they actually have to service the classroom needs for those students. You could have other issues, policy issues that come up where you have to address that need. And so I think there's importance in serving that. But at the same time, districts don't want to necessarily continue with, portables as the only option, right? It's not necessarily preferred. And so if you take something, and I forget which option, I apologize, I can't remember all the numbers, but there was an option that suggested that districts could be incentivized, per se, for removing a portable early, right? And that you could acquire your eligibility. You combine that with the fact that if you still have funding for installing portables when you need it, but at the same time, when you're ready to remove those portables, now you've got an incentive, you've got a financial incentive that says, now I can access the funds I need to get rid of that thing and put a permanent structure on site. I think that's a very powerful combination. It's something that should be explored further. So,
okay. Are there any other comments?
Eric Bakke with the Los Angeles Unified School District. Thanks for having this today. My comments kind of bridge some of the earlier conversation about modernization in urban districts. In our district years ago, we saw an enrollment boom of about 200,000 kids. Portables were the only way we can house those kids in such short notice. It took us so long to access land in such a dense environment, we wouldn't be able to do it without portables. So back then, there was certainly a need. Who's to say that maybe we might experience something in the future? I don't know. So I just put that out there.
Did you use new construction grants for those portables?
This was
or did you?
This was before we actually had a bond program.
Right.
So that's what actually prompted the folks in our community to start supporting the bonds, was the sudden growth. Even today, we've built 130 brand new schools, all permanent. I still have 200,000 kids in portables today. We still have a need. We want to get rid of our portables. We're working towards that. We've got a lot of the portables off. We've got all of our schools. And the primary reason we've kept the portables was because we wanted to maintain traditional 2-semester schools. For years, decades. I don't think LA's seen their school without a multi-track, 6-track school system. So for right now, we're continuing to build. We just passed a bond in 2008. We're just starting to hopefully issue it at the end of the year. But our plan is going to look at our existing schools. For example, there's a school in 9th Street. It just opened up. It had been closed for the past 4 years. It was built in 1890. It was operational until a few years ago. The school provided virtually no services or features for those kids in that school whatsoever. It just opened up today. It is the pride and joy of that school. It sits in downtown Los Angeles, right on Skid Row. And that community could not be happier. There's only about 3, well, there's now 4 elementary schools that service the downtown Los Angeles area. And so it's a great school. It's serving about 800 kids, and it's serving both. It's a cohabitation with charter school and public school. So what we had to use was portables during that interim, sited at different school sites. So the portables do serve a purpose. I don't think anyone argues that they should be the sole source of housing.
So this is where I struggle. I agree. There's a purpose. Certainly, interim housing, you're not going to build permanent for interim housing. You have a short-term enrollment bubble you're trying to deal with. Right. You know, because we don't know exactly how many kids are going to sign up at every school every year. So there are times when I think there's an appropriate use. The question becomes with state funds, and we're building permanent, basically we should be building permanent buildings to house kids that we expect to be there over time. Should we be, one, incentivizing bringing on portables? Because our district did sort of what you did with portables at grade way back before we could pass a bond. I will tell you that the buildings do not last in the same way that permanent construction does. I mean, I may be biased there. I mean, I remember I visited a Jensen Ranch Elementary School in Castro Valley that was all portables at grade, and it looked great when it was first done, but a few years down the road, there was a noticeable difference. And even when they're designed to be there on an interim basis, too often, you know, you've got 25, 30 years down the road, you're still doing this. So it always drove me nuts when 30% of the buildings had to be, I don't know, permanent, relocatable, whatever you want to call. We didn't bring on the wheel-on ones for that in our district. But also, when I will give the same grant amount for a permanent stick-built that I do for portables, sometimes you incentivize that, and then 20 years down the road, you really can't necessarily modernize. You find yourself in a position to replace with even less money, so you're in a worse financial situation than you're in today. And part of the reasons we've had the critically overcrowded schools and the ORG grants and everything else is to allow kids, regardless of their neighborhood, to go to school in a quality school that's permanent construction. So part of what we do with this program in providing grants is we also tend to incentivize. And so when I look at this, and this is an area that, you know, potentially does cost more, but the question is that how do we then, for districts that have significant numbers of portables, provide incentives to replace them if we believe long-term we need to have more permanent buildings? My own belief is that modernizing them is a waste of money, your money and my money, the state's money, okay? I just don't think it's what we should be doing. But at the same time, and you know now that we don't double count anymore, and then we can allow your modernization funds to go towards replacing portables without creating a problem. But my question is should we then allow those students to be added back into new construction eligibility and provide an incentive, you know, once and for all to actually build permanent construction to replace these portables and really give the kids the school facilities they need? You know, at the same time, on new construction, I'm not sure new construction dollars should be used for these wheel-on portables. Maybe you had to, and I know you didn't do it with state funds. I mean, there are times, but I just don't see how it's a wise use of taxpayer dollars to continue to have these all over the state of California.
This has been something I've been talking about, too. First of all, I think there's a difference between portable and modular. Okay.
I'm talking about the wheel-on.
So, I mean, this, yeah, I'm 100% in line with the chair that I do not see a dollar spent on anything that's not going to last the 30 years it takes me to pay it off. Right. Okay, period. And I don't think the ones that are meant for the bump ups, the temporary housing, things like that, are meant to be there for 30 years. But I do think maybe, and I didn't read all the options, but maybe one of them is if we start a program that some kind of pool of dollars from somewhere that we actually help lease out those things for a short period of time, 5 years or less, and we follow the bump up or something. You know, so that way you're not taking out of building funds, but you have this rotating stock that you use. I'm sorry?
We had that program.
Did you? That didn't work either? Or?
It was an excellent program, emergency repair or emergency classroom program, right? It was an excellent program.
Yeah, I just don't want to see 30-year bond money going towards something that's not going to last at least the 30-plus years going out there. And then, so the lease option be something I'd be interested in, or the different levels of funding. I'm not going to pay the same amount per student for something that's not going to last that long as you would for something else. That may be the reverse incentive versus paying them to take down the portables, saying, look, if we're going to rebuild or modernize, you're going to get a smaller amount for something that's not permanent versus larger amount that is, and try to work that into it. Because I do see the flexibility needs for districts to be able to be flexible. You know, from this session, I'm moving over, I'm remodelizing this school, and need to shut it down for 2 years while I do it, so I got to spread it out through other schools. But that's what leasing's for. You put them out there for 2 years, and then when after you rebuild this other one, you move them back in. But it shouldn't be the bond funds going toward that, the long-term bond dollars.
Well, in replacement should be, if you are replacing with permanent, you brought in your utilities. That's why some of these costs can go so high, because of the grading, the utilities, and everything else. But, you know, I do question, should we have an incentive to be able to help districts finish replacing their portables?
My point was just simply that they serve a purpose. They still have a need, and I just wouldn't want the program to be so rigid that it excludes your option to even think about that, to house.
So how would you do that? Do you have any thoughts on, okay, I mean, would you expect new construction grants, the same level of grants for a wheel on portable?
No. We've had this issue several years ago on this particular issue about new construction grants and the value of the grant for the use of your modernization or your portable or your modular. Your costs are not the same. You know, your per pupil grant was based on the idea that you're talking about a new site, new development. When you're talking about portables or modulars, are usually, at least in my case, in our district's case, it's in addition to an existing school site. So you don't have a lot of the same site development work as much as you would if you had a brand new site that you're starting from scratch. And so the per pupil grant for new construction is far overvalued. How it should get tweaked or adjusted, I mean, we haven't run any numbers to figure that out, but certainly it's a lot more than it's necessary. So from that perspective, I think one of the recommendations was to adjust the per pupil grant for new construction, for modulars or portables, and we would concur that that makes a lot of sense.
So then if you bring in modulars or portables, even with a lower new construction grant, what happens 20 years down the road when they really need to be replaced and can't be modernized? I mean, what are you doing over the life cycle of those buildings?
Our district looks at it at this point. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, it was a life and death kind of a situation. It wasn't even contemplated, you know, the good or bad. It was just, this is what we have to do.
I agree with you on that. You were stuck.
Nowadays, where we're at, you know, we've got a $7 billion bond that we're going to undertake, and our plan is to do a number of the 9th Street elementary schools. We're going to tear down existing schools because they no longer serve their purpose. They're far beyond, you know, their need, but we don't have sites to build, so we have to use and look at the existing school sites.
But you can
Lisa
still
and
use,
Juan
but
were able
there's
to come.
nothing that would prohibit you from using portables for interim housing, correct?
No, and that's what I'm saying, is that we just want to make sure that there's some ability to do that. Instead, the way I was reading these options, it just seemed as though there was no recognition, no eligibility, no way to incorporate it into your budgets.
I still want to use bond money to pay for interim housing, though. I just don't.
And for us, we're going to use it on, like you were saying, not necessarily lease. For us, it makes more sense to buy them and move them than to lease them. But the reality is that they're short term.
But you have to use.
You want to use them, but you could lease them, you could use operational funds, something else besides a 30-year bond.
But I mean, most schools, if you're replacing a school, we have, part of your total cost of the project is bringing on some temporary wheel-on portables to house those kids for the year, a year and a half while you're going through construction, and then you take them away.
But the state doesn't give you additional funds for it.
We just want to make sure that's still intact. Not to close the door on that as an option as we go forward. Just recognize that need.
So a different scale for new construction, different scale for add-on to existing site, which would be less, and then some possibility of short-term housing dollars, leasing expenditure monies out of that for the project.
Supplemental grant.
Supplemental grant.
That you can add together.
I have a couple of comments, and that not necessarily directed to your testimony, Eric, but just in general on this issue. One being that I would strongly support the ability that the modernization dollars, that we're not modernizing portables. I do think that money should be going to replacement of those units. They do have their useful life, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. I have a completely different direction on some of this, in the sense of the equity issue of why some entities, school districts or county offices, have had to utilize this type of construction. And to me, the interesting facts would be around how much of our hardship projects are portable. Because I think that is a part of the issue. I'm not sure there was an incentive to use, to decrease the cost of classrooms so I can build some huge multipurpose room or gym or something to that effect. I think there's potentially a group of projects that, because they're under hardship, which means they had to stay within the state standards at the time, they had to go to that form of construction to meet their budgets. And to me, that's the more, I'd like to see the quantitative component of that, and to address that issue, that have we forced some districts and county offices and others into that situation merely because of the cost? And if so, we ought to correct that in the new program.
Well, financial hardship is going to be another discussion. But I think, and I think you may be right there. I don't know. I mean, I think under financial hardship, you've seen permanent, you've seen portables, but it probably is not enough. So I think we need to talk about that and eligibility. I do think, though, as most of the speakers have said, most of the portables that are here today in districts throughout the state are here because prior to Prop 39, when districts basically couldn't pass bonds at all, their only option was to add portables. And when class size reduction came in, it was August. You had to have buildings done, within a little over a month's time. And then as you expanded to grade levels, your only option to get them on that quickly was portables. And so we had an explosion of use there. And
we had a statewide policy that 30% of your construction had to be in portables. So those still exist.
They didn't have to be in wheel-on portables. I mean, you could have, you could have the modular ones where they come in, pour the slab, steel. I mean, essentially, or and the 30% they could be, yes. Removable, but I know from our own district, we poured slabs. We had the relocatable, but our 30% were not all wheel-on portables. And I don't believe that the requirement was strictly wheel-on.
Whether they were wheel-on or not,
right?
They had to go.
Yeah. Well, I know it's right, but I think there's a combination, and we've been stuck with all these and. I just don't think it's a good expenditure of taxpayer funds to continue to modernize buildings that just don't get the job done and aren't initially the best utilization of the site.
Madam Chair, somebody mentioned earlier maybe an old timer could give some input on something, and I don't know if there's any old timer in the room, but I'll maybe stand in because I have a few years in this program. Several things. One, there was a period of time when people referred to portables, and there were two different kinds. And really, one was not a portable. It was the wheel-on, and it was a trailer. It was a DOH, Department of Housing, label on the building. And it was true that those were used in California, and they were used throughout California to meet the needs of housing students. And there's a direct relationship to that, to another policy area that I want to make. But the other kind of portable is the portable that is approved by the Division of the State Architect, which meets Field Act standards, structural safety standards, fire and life safety standards, and access compliance standards. And certainly those grew over time. But those of us that worked in schools during the period of time of the 1980s and 1990s, when we had this tremendous explosion of growth, had to make a choice. You'd go with a DOH trailer because it actually had wheels on it and axles when it came onto the site, and then it was put on jack stands just like a car in a garage, or do you go with a DSA approved building? And that was a choice sometimes that had to be made quickly, but the people that I remember working with, and including those in my district when I was a CBO and a superintendent, went for the safe buildings that are the DSA buildings. And those buildings were indeed portable because they could be moved, and they didn't have wheels on them, but they could be moved and they could be put, as I think you were referencing earlier, they could be above grade with a ramp, or they could be basically on a slab on grade or something else. Those buildings kept school districts like my school district that grew by, in 1 year, no exaggeration, 24% between June and September. Another year, it was 18. It was double digits for about 5 years in a row. Without those buildings, we wouldn't have been housing children. We would have been on year-round school and potentially just maybe going into the tank financially because it was so tremendous in terms of growth. Those portable buildings allowed us to educate students. So
did you get new construction grants for those buildings?
If the other policy area that I was going to reference this to is developer fees, and I want to come to that. But to answer your question, you could, under the state program, probably figure out a way to do that before the statutes of 1986. But the statutes of 86, and there were 3 bills that basically combined together to change the program. That's where you had to build the 30% classrooms as portables. Right. And God rest his soul, Senator Leroy Green believed that because you have population shifts, that you should be able to move.
You could just move them from one area to the other.
And so districts purchase portable classrooms or relocatable classrooms. They also built stick-built classrooms that could be moved, basically taken away from the rest of the building. They were typically on the end of the building. But you can walk through them today, and you can hear the residents because of walking. You know that there's crawl space underneath them. But
well, not all the stick-built had crawl space. Some were on slabs.
Some could have been on slabs as well. The point about portables is that they have been a mainstay in California. That we could not have sustained the growth that we had in the 80s and 90s without them. Now, just another point, and Ms. Moore brought this up, that the state had an emergency portable program, and that portable program saved a number of us, and because indeed it was to go quickly, and after a period of time, it went very, very quickly when there was a change in the executive officer at OPSC who said, we need to make this happen, and it was done quickly. And I'll be quick here, but I really wanted to make a couple of points. If you say portable, you can say portable and mean like saying car. There isn't just one kind of car. There's many different kinds of cars that you could purchase. Portables may be purchased meeting Field Act standards that may be higher end or lower end. The state's emergency portables were on a bid, and they typically were a lower end portable. But they met Field Act standards, and they were serviceable buildings, and I remember using hundreds of them. But I don't think portable is a pejorative term, and I think there's been some discussion that portable really has a negative connotation to it. We need to have portable classrooms in California because of a variety of things. When you were dialoguing with Ms. Steer and she was talking about trying to plan, you can't really plan with that kind of growth without expecting that you're going to have portable classrooms.
I don't think anyone's saying you can't have portable classrooms on campuses. I don't think, unless I'm wrong, I don't think there's anyone who's saying you can't have portables, and clearly we need to refine the definition. The questions we're asking is, one, what kind of construction should we incentivize?
Through the state program.
Through the state program. And two, I think some of us are trying to acknowledge that we still have a portable problem, and I'm going to use the word portable, not to negative, in the state of California, where we have portables that most people would agree have exceeded their useful life. And, you know, the question becomes, do we provide money for modernization, or is it a better use of everyone's funds to provide some kind of additional incentive to replace those portables, which we know we're going to need to be on the school for.
Well, one suggestion, and this is really what I was motivated to come up and say initially, was that you have a regulation in place that is not statute, and it's really not based in statute, that identifies how long a portable may be on a site in a school district and not be charged as a building that would be considered permanently there. And that was changed. It used to be considered to be 5 years by your reg, and it was changed in 2005, I believe, through our urging to at least go out to 8 years because of a disagreement that we had with a former executive officer. My point is, you could adjust that regulation, not needing any legislation, and basically potentially have a profound effect upon districts being able to replace certain portables with permanent classrooms.
What I don't get, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, is I don't know a district that's ever brought on a portable that's thought that portable was going to be there 5 or 10 years down the road. Districts that I see, they bring them on because they have some kind of critical housing need at the time, whether it's unexpected growth, whether it's class size reduction, whatever it is, they have a housing need that they need to satisfy. Yes. The easiest way to satisfy that is through portables. You could say, okay, well, we won't count it against you for the first 5 years, but after that we will, or we won't count it against you for the first 8 years, and after that you will. But chances are pretty good that most of those portables are going to still be there 5 to 8 years down because that school that you're building costs more than you anticipated, or you weren't able to pass the bond, or the state program ran out of money, or whatever, and so you still have them. And now to count them against them provides even less of an incentive to replace them, when I think, we have to ask ourselves as a state, what kind of facilities we want for all of our children. And I think most of us would agree that if we had a choice, we'd have all high-quality, stick-built buildings. We're never going to reach that goal because there's always going to be things that are unforeseen. But when we're spending the state dollars, should we try and provide incentives to have the stick built? Should we try and provide incentives to replace what we're all calling the portables that no one likes, to replace those with permanent construction, so that over the life cycle of that building, when it comes time to modernize it again or whatever, we're modernizing a building that's really meant to last a long period of time.
Well, one thing you could do is review that regulation. So let me go to the other issue. The use of those DOH trailers and DSA portable buildings really became an issue and a need in California because of the growth I mentioned. But they're directly linked to developer fees. In 1979, SB 201 became law, and those of us that were dealing with schools and development at the time dealt with it. And basically that statute, which is still in place, identified that you could spend those dollars on the rental of temporary classrooms. And that was one of the reasons why I think that industry took off in meeting the needs of districts who were trying to respond to the environment. So we have a linkage there that has stayed in place for some time. And I think you kind of got to the issue of why in the discussion we had with Heather Steer. So let's look maybe broadly at how we plan, and if the state program is expecting us to put in permanent classrooms, then to recognize that those permanent classrooms may be funded by the state if that's the intent, but that some largesse needs to be given districts because they're not just going to happen overnight, and spikes of growth are going to happen. Maybe it's not going to be like the 80s and the 90s again, but certainly it looks like it's going to be in Ms. Steer's district. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening.
Are there any more comments on?
Hello. My name is Bill Stillwell. I'm a member of the School Facilities Manufacturers Association, and I represent Mealis Modular Buildings in Lodi. There's a third definition of modular construction that seems to be eluding everybody here. It's custom modular components.
Right.
It's an actual slab-on grade.
Yeah.
It's
We're not, those aren't the buildings we're referring to when we talk about portables.
But as we go through this, modular kind of gets thrown into that portable thing, and it's, we just want to make very clear as an association that everybody is understanding.
We understand those aren't wheel-on portables.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just one last comment, and sorry to excuse myself, Madam Chair, but I do have another commitment I'm late for. I think a lot of this stuff came from the regular SAB meetings where we're looking at building a new school site, you have so much eligibility, the school district gets X amount of dollars. We're expecting those dollars to be spent in a permanent, what we call 30-plus year facility, and then the school district gets their dollars, matches up with their bond dollars, and then 4 years later when they're going to build something different than what the expectations were, or maybe not the same cost of buildings being put in. So, there's always different cost of whatever kind of structure you build, and because of other priorities that came up or other issues or this don't have as much money, a lot of times those state dollars are not being used on the permanent structures, and that's, I think, all we're trying to get to here. If you're going to use that 30-year bond money, can we put in something that's going to last that period of time? There's definitely a place for portables. Should we have another program if we go off a new bond for temporary type of buildings? Should we incentivize more other type of construction techniques to bring the cost down? I mean, looking at the one example from Santa Ana, it's $6,000 a student versus $120,000 a student in Oakland as far as facilities, not apples and oranges completely. But do we having that regulation, since our initial thought with this is we just give the state money and you guys do what you want, but is there any recourse? Now, like Ms. Moore's point that, hey, if you spend your eligibility, there's no exception, come back up, we're not going to give you nothing else. Maybe there should just be that much absolutes. But on the appeal process, what I've been hearing is a lot of district administrations that get stuck with decisions that were made by previous administrations. And so the people who are currently in charge had nothing to do with the circumstance they're in now, and they come to us and say, well, we need to be the exception because, well, the previous two superintendents ago or the previous board, 15 years ago made bad choices. And what we're talking about is not current year budgets or anything like that. We're talking about a long time for the state to pay back these bonds. And so there should be the minimum criteria at all that we invest our bond dollars. The local school districts can do what they want with their money, their operations, but there should be criteria for what we spend our dollars in.
Do you have a comment you'd like to make?
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Michael Knapp. I'm the chair of the School Facilities Manufacturers Association. Been listening to the discussion, and I think there is a point of view that the subcommittee needs to consider. The school districts are making a clear point that they need portables to respond to their demographics, and no question about that. But ultimately, it's really a question of money. We build facilities for a school district today, and if they have sufficient monies, however that's come through and all the various grants, if it's hardship grants or if they have developer fees or however they can get local bonds, if they have enough money, they're going to build permanent facilities. And when they don't, they start thinking about portables. And my empirical experience from dealing with the districts is that there is a difference not only in the facilities in response to the demographics, but also in those facilities as learning environments. And there is a difference. And I guess I would point out to the subcommittee, and Kathleen Moore, you are sure acutely aware of this, that difference is also something that the districts need to consider and do consider very, very sincerely. So I don't have an answer to what you're grappling with, and I understand Assemblyman Buchanan, your point of view completely. It's a complex problem. My point is it really boils down to a money problem ultimately for the districts. And the facilities they want to have are controlled by how they can fund them.
Well, they're controlled, in terms of your developer fees, whether they're level 1 or level 2, they're controlled by a local community's willingness to step up, because the state has never been a 100% source of funding.
I understand
In
that.
fact, you go back to the 70s, pre-Prop 13, and the state basically provided zero. Occasionally you get your, emergency funding for schools, but schools were responsibility of local communities. We have a situation now where we have a program where the state's designed to partner with local communities to help provide an incentive for local communities to pass bonds and to be able to build quality schools so we can get rid of this sort of backlog that we've accumulated, where I think we all agree aren't the kind of learning environments we'd like to provide for all of our students. So I'm not sure we've resolved the issue entirely. I think there is some consensus that we'd like to have incentives to build, but replace what I would call the old wheel-on portables that really aren't providing the kind of educational environments we'd like, that we'd like to have incentives to be able to build permanent stick-built versus the, I don't know what you want to call them, wheel-on portable, whatever you want to call them. I'm not sure we've come up with what the right combination is there, but I don't think it serves the state well to put money into buildings that we know were really not designed to last long-term. So are there any other comments?
I would just comment that I did applaud the staff for their phrase of the permanent modular.
Yeah.
That they have currently.
Right, I know, it's hard. So I think we have the gentleman from San Francisco, and then items 4 and 5 in our packets are really just there to provide background information. I don't know if we have, I know Sullivan Hagman has to leave, but.
Hello again, Paul Cardone, San Francisco Unified. You already have an incentive for replacing bungalows, and that's the Overcrowded Relief Grant Program. If you want to simplify it and promote bungalow replacement, you need to provide a supplemental grant under the MOD program that provides a grant that perhaps could equal 60% of the replacement cost of the bungalows with permanent facilities.
But the ORG program works well from San Francisco, it works well for LA. There are districts that have portables that don't qualify to participate in the ORG that they would like to replace as well.
Well, then you just, I don't know whether they were participating in the school facility program or not. If you could just provide the incentive somewhere for them to, and make it enough money to make it worth their while to replace those units.
Right. But I think it's the questions we're dealing with is how do we make sure we have the incentive to replace? And then how do we make sure that there's some sort of incentive to build, and I think it's what all of you want to do now, to build permanent facilities now going forward, so you don't find yourself 20 years from now with the same kind of background buildup you have of portables, or worse than where you are right now.
Thank you.
So I like the direction the committee's taken in terms of understanding that school districts do have a need to have a tool at their disposal, whether that tool is a portable building or not. And there are needs for those. I think for me, even in school closures, we found a necessity to use portables to displace the housing when we're trying to find savings from closing schools in areas where we don't have the enrollment. And so we do need those portables. The ORG program, I think, has been a good program. Even Oakland's been benefited by that, I think, to the tune of at least 2 projects. I think the problem for me, kind of elephant in the room, is like sometimes it's a very top-down kind of mandate, as in 94 when the requirement was 30% of our stock being portables. I think that it would be refreshing to have the state come back and say, as an incentive, because we help push you into a position where you've got that kind of sprawl on your campuses, that you guys work out some type of incentive associated with that mandate from back then that actually reverses out that number of portables. For us, obviously, stick-built permanent construction does facilitate the best type of opportunity to create the learning environments necessary for students today. And we would much rather, as the gentleman said, have permanent stick-built construction than not. But in some cases, particularly in some of our more depressed areas, the best you could do is a portable. And a portable facility will be a much better educational environment than some of the stick-built facilities that we have. So
I can tell you that even in more suburban environments, there are times, given the design of the school, that they'd rather be in portables. So is there any other comment? Tabs 4 and 5 were provided as background, and our committee's getting a little bit thin, so I would maybe, there's no objection.
Are we going to put him over to talk? Because there are options that are related to the class. Excuse me.
Yeah,
There are options related, so we'll talk about them later, or?
I would think it'd be better, I mean,
What do you think?
yeah, I think we should put him over.
Yeah, no, I
but
we'll still talk about him, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not,
Okay.
I'm not opposed. I just think that we've
Yeah.
covered a huge area, which we know, and there's more to talk about, but I would go ahead and thank everyone for coming and your input. Adjourn the meeting for today. And we'll
Can I just make a final
yes,
comment?
That's right.
I personally really appreciate all the stakeholder testimony that came forward today, and I would encourage districts and other entities that are affected by what the State Allocation Board may consider in the future. I would encourage you to continue to come forward. Your input that you provided today is, I think, creates value added to the conversation.
Right, yeah, and I echo that. Tom, Duffy, and I had a conversation. It's much more helpful to have your input while we're discussing these things than, a month or two later. So, and we don't have all the answers. We're just trying to explore different areas. So, thank you very much.
And thank you to staff for all the work they went into
I know.
putting this huge package together.
You know what? We're all learning a great deal, and that's critically important to hopefully coming up with a good program.
Sorry.